Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show. Today, bringing you another really awesome guest. Today, we have the honor of being joined by Ian Watson, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Chemical and Biological Defense at our United States Department of Defense, where he serves as the principal advisor to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biologic Defense programs, and is focused on conducting department-level research, development, and acquisition activities from concept and requirement development through early science and technology, ultimately through to advanced development, testing, evaluation, and procurement, ultimately with these efforts focusing on reducing risk from emerging threats and fielding various sustainable capabilities to all the services in the U.S. military, ultimately to ensure our warfighters can fight and ultimately win in chemical, biologic, radiologic, and nuclear contested environments. Previous to this, Mr. Watson served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary and Director of the Office of Strategy, Policy, Planning, and Requirements, and for industrial base expansion in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, or ASPR, which is within our Department of Health and Human Services. Prior to that, Mr. Watson was part of the OSTP, Assistant Director for Biotechnology and Biosecurity within the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House. There, ultimately focused on the mission of ensuring that our country is a world leader in science and technology. And there he worked on a variety of topics pertaining to science and technology policy, including bioeconomy, biodefense, scientific collaborations, biologic sciences, and planetary protection, which is a really cool topic we'll be getting into. And then prior to that role, he served in various additional roles at the Department of Defense, including focusing on countering weapons of mass destruction research, countering threat networks, proliferation initiatives, and general threat reduction. Mr. Watson has a graduate background that includes degrees in international relations, biodefense, and public health. We're honored to have him. A lot of really cool topics to get into today. A great guest. Ian Watson, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show today.
It is a pleasure to be with you, Ira. Thank you very much for having me. It's an honor.
It's great having you. I enjoyed reading all about you and what you've been doing the last couple of decades. Would love to, start things off as we typically do, handing you the floor for a bit. If you could sort of take us back to your early story, how you got started on this journey, a little bit about, I know you worked, studied poli-sci, international relations. Talk a little bit about the early days and a little bit about sort of when biodefense crept into this and you began thinking about things like anthrax vaccines.
Yeah, appreciate it. It's a meandering tale and stuff, and I'm not sure all that exciting, but I think with anyone, I had a specific interest early on in internet. Growing up in Central Illinois, I was, kind of cut off from the world, but spent a lot of time with my father and others traveling worldwide to the degree possible from a farm community. I honestly, when I went into undergraduate, the thing that most interested me was international relations, but in that eventually evolved. But poli-sci and international relations, where I was interested in not only how systems work along with economics and in different cultures and how those develop politically, but also how decision making was made within governments and all. And it really led me more into international relations and understanding juxtapositions on how states develop, and particularly that kind of meandered between more of the philosophy side of the house, and also in some of the Republic and early works by our political philosophers. From there, though, I mean, it really became more entrenched in the arms control aspect. So as you start niching your way through and understanding yourself better through undergraduate and to graduate school, I think my focus ended up being more, and surprisingly more, on the nuclear side of the house, but understanding what deterrence actually represents, understanding how quid pro quo related responsible negotiations and solidifying trustworthiness within nations and stuff to establish controls that protect populations worldwide was interesting. And I think that's where some of my early work kind of led me into the arms control versus international, a whole bunch of other areas you can go into. And I'm highly interested in all of them, but that's kind of the areas I think I kind of focused on. And so I think with that in graduate school, I hadn't thought about going into more technical areas, but I started also recognizing my high interest, probably at a later stage than I should have, beyond the liberal arts and all. And so I think that led me also to my second graduate school, into my second master's and stuff. And that started studying through the microbiology and biodefense related activities. And in there that started focusing on some of the critical needs within diagnostics, within particularly medical countermeasures development, regulatory understandings. At first, I mean, the overall studies were more towards, like I said, deterrence and arms control. But as I started swaying more towards the biological sciences, and I was fortunate to have, because I think that early on in my career, that kind of cross paths. I did my second master's a little bit later in my life, and then went back yet again. So I continually kind of went back to school. But in my initial upfront 20-year career working in defense, a lot of it was on missile systems. I was systems integrator for Patriot and MEADS missile systems, a lot of air defense, and then even all the way through not only working in the Office of Secretary of Defense on things like the airborne laser system that was never made it to fielding, but understanding how those systems contribute to an overall integrated defense. And so working even as a systems integrator back as a GS-13 for the Army and trying to set those up, those were foundational and kind of took me away from it. I think eventually I was looking for jobs that would get me more back into the international space. And I think that's where I found DTRA and the interest to not only match up with they are the preeminent organization for DoD for arms control and making sure that the implementation of those, from open skies to START treaty, through those was important. But I ended up landing a job more on the international side within the Joint Science and Technology Office. And that is a component of the Chemical and Biological Defense Program many years ago. And that, I think, pulled me more in line, and that also led to that second master's degree more in the biological sciences. And really, I have been in that area, which is expounded because it's quite a broad area to go from not only just biodefense, but at the onset of understanding, I think under Andy Weber and also our CDC colleagues, the launching of global health security, actually, how public health and the intersect with that, defense support to civil authorities. It ranges in response and understanding, which will play out later on under COVID, but also the responsibilities of it working over at ASPR. So really, I kind of didn't purposely do that, and that's I'm kind of a broad range of the things I've worked on, but that suits me. I very much like working different mission sets and expounding on it, and it's proven a really not a purposefully planned career, but I've been really pleased with not only the experts I've been able to work with, but really the topics and the different mission sets. Each one of those have their contributions, which has led me to where I am today. And so I've been fortunate to be in the position I am and trying to make a contribution. I'm happy to elaborate on any of that, but those are kind of the early days. I like to say, like, as if I was my son, kind of, he has a preset from 14-year-old, a preset plan for his entire life. I don't think I was ever that type of individual, but interested in many things and willing to put my toe into things that I don't have expertise in, but highly interested. So that's it's your plight as a human, is to have too many interests and not enough time.
No, it's awesome. It's a story of many twists and turns and all different disciplines and continually learning, as you point out, multiple degrees along the way, where you're learning about history one day and then about virulence factors the next. And no, I
That's right.
appreciate you laying this out. It's a great beginning to it all. And it's interesting because you talk a little about your time at DITRA and again, you move up the chain at DITRA for progressively more and more responsibilities in the chem bio space. You go, as I mentioned in the bio, on loan to OSTP at the White House to broadly focus on what's referred to as bioeconomy. And it's a very interesting time you get there because there's sort of a perfect storm that's occurring in those years. And the couple of years before, you have sort of, the 2010 pandemics pre-COVID. So you got Ebola and Zika and H1N1. You have all this neat technology coming online, the CRISPRs, the gene drives, and all the other bleeding edge stuff that's happening. And then I guess the third pillar, you know more about this than I, but bad actors that are out there, let's just say, that are thinking bad things. He gets to the White House, and the focus is the bioeconomy, but clearly there's a a theme here. Talk a little bit about the time at OSTP and a little bit about how sort of what's going on in the 2010s pre-COVID sort of crafts how you advise the president and everyone there on what the bioeconomy should look like in the coming years.
Yeah. And so interesting because they actually didn't bring me on for bioeconomy. In fact, that there was no initiative on the bioeconomy. They brought me on overall as biosecurity
Yeah,
and also biotechnology writ large, right? And
yeah,
that has both the security aspects of it and the promotional aspects of how biotechnology is beneficial. But there hadn't been any true one. It was really colleagues within the National Security Council that we had started talking because we had worked a lot before. Not it wasn't just about the defense against and make in preparation for either a naturally occurring pandemic or, in the case of biodefense, an intentional usage of that. And
yeah,
we were coming out of GWAT, right? So a lot of actors, a lot of technologies you said had fused into the system and made accessibility and tacit knowledge lower, but those barriers had always been a concern. I think what we saw was the dovetailing of that technology and the protection of it. And that led to a lot of discussions on two things I think came into, and you aptly wrap that up. One, I think with the convergence of that, we saw that countering economic aggression from other foreign foreign adversaries or ones looking to undermine our industrial base. The strength of the industrial base in biotechnology is unique, right? And we saw that it was spurring it within the United States, not only it's an entirely new industry and industrial revolution on everything will be determined by engineering of life, right, from medicines to materials to everything else, surpassing that of the chemical revolution and stuff. And the potential not only for the workforce but not just on the coastlines in east and west and where you would see some of the bright minds, but across America, replacing some of those industrial sectors like I came from in central Illinois that had evaporated, right? Some of that workforce and stuff. So the opportunity came there for not only countering economic aggression, but trying to actually put in place policies that buttress and grow that industry, recognizing very much that it's unique. It's not like the semiconductors or the microprocessors or in the information industries that came before it. It had unique qualifications. How do you look at property rights on genes or
yeah,
biological samples? How do you? There wasn't a lot of protection, so you had a lot of tradecraft that was held internally instead of IP protections. It had different values of death and stuff like that.
yeah,
Shorter times for venture capitalists, the longer times for delivering on products. A lot of good industries setting up, but also being bought out. A lot of academic institutions being drawn away. I mean, academics being drawn away to China and other places. So what it came to was a security issue and a promotional thing. How do we make this the utile to the American public? as a new industrial capability. This is the next stage of what we need to do as we understand biology under life and how to manipulate it better in a responsible manner. And it brings that biosafety and security into consideration as well. And so really, Phil Farrow, who you may know and stuff like that, he worked on the National Security Council. We decided that instead of it being an OSTP or an NSC explicit thing, it was all the above. So we partnered to make it a security plus a promotional. So you have your science and technology office for the president, along with your national security office for the president, combining together to try to formulate a policy and a support for a bioeconomy. The term wasn't novel, right? And nor was the work that's done before. But oftentimes, as you look at different countries, it focused a lot on environmental things, how to transitioning off of gasoline into biofuels.
Yep.
But the broadening of that was not to be an application towards only biomanufacturing or only biofuels. It was to look at the holistic application of biology and the potentiality of it in the future, and bring on the academics, the true CEOs of those companies and stuff in partnership with the White House and our interagency partners to make sustainable policy across this industrial base. And so it was again, back to our prior conversation, not intended, but it was seen as really the coalescence of multiple strains, both national security, industrial provision, but also countering economic aggression and understanding how we're being undermined in this new technical field early on. And that took so many players across the interagency. So to say that I did the bioeconomy was not true. Phil Farrow, the interagency, and others really contributed, and it didn't make it over because of the COVID outbreak. That
Sure.
EO never actually made it over the finish line, and to our counterparts and our colleagues took it in this administration and finally got it into implementation, which is a huge kudos to those individuals serving now that made that happen.
Very cool. Well, still another important sort of part of the map here on your journey. So I wanted to go there before we get into everything happening now. But no, I appreciate you outlining some of that time. It was interesting. I don't know if you saw a couple of weeks ago, I had Dr. Jerome Adams on the show, who served as our 20th Surgeon General of the United States, and he jokes around that he's neither a surgeon nor a general, but he went into sort of the setup of the U.S. Public Health Service Commission Corps, and you got generals and admirals and commodores or what, all these different titles. You, as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, are, I'm told, sort of the equivalent of a 2-star general at the Pentagon, and you report to those that are 3-star generals and all that. Can you just introduce us a bit too? Because I know sort of the your group and a variety of other groups related in terms of energy and sustainment and acquisition all fall under sort of an umbrella of sort of the broader acquisition sustainment mission of at the Pentagon, sort of enabling delivery and sustainment of secure, resilient, and preeminent capabilities for the warfighter. Introduce us a little bit, and we'll be getting into obviously the ChemBio plan and what's going to be happening in the future. But could you walk us through a little bit of what it means to be a DASD, and a little bit of sort of what the role entails?
Oh, geez, yeah. I'll give it a whirl. Each one's a little bit different, but I also note that Surgeon General Jerome I have a good picture of him at HHS headquarters. He delivered my influenza vaccine to my arm personally, because he ran around during COVID, making sure that while COVID was spurring, we weren't succumbing to influenza for the workforce as well. So I've been inoculated by the Surgeon General himself.
There you go.
No, but so the DASD ship and stuff, because we're part of the Office of the Secretary of Defense, it's kind of a unique position. That is for us and my fellow DASDs at that level, really to perform the oversight and making sure all the work is truly done at the services, at our agencies, and in the joint staff and our policy colleagues and stuff. But when it comes to, particularly within us, I fall under Dr. LaPlante and stuff like that, who is the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment. In that, we have a lot of responsibilities across that acquisition portion of it. As far as equivalencies, it's a weird little. I mean, civilians like to try to compare themselves to it. So if you had to, I mean, you need it in a hierarchical system like the DoD. We're tiered, and so meaning it's not the same way in other departments and agencies, and at times. For us, they do an equivalency. So yes, I would be about what they consider a 2.5 star by level separation from the SecDef. But my boss, actually, Miss Rosenblum, is a 4-star. So as Assistant Secretary of Defense in the political position, so the differential is most of the positions above us then become our political and our policy setting experts and stuff like that, and leadership that come in. But us as DASDs, we're usually, not always, because there are DASDs that are politically selected in certain cases. But most of the time, we're the continuity at the Office of Secretary of Defense as the career civil servants, right? We keep not only the knowledge and the bodyhood, but also keep the train running. But our oversight of not only the budget, but also the policy decisions, we knit implementation of budget and POMing to strategic priorities. So when we have a new national defense strategy, are we readjusting across the lines to make sure that the organizations that are responsible for acquisition, responsible for science and technology, experimentation, or requirements development are making sure that they're either making the pivot towards how the national strategy has changed, and likewise like that. So policy from our political force, strategy from the department level, we fuse those to make sure that the implementation then occurs with the organizations we oversee. And the same is for the chemical and biological defense program. The only difference and oddity is that unlike other programs, this is our 30th anniversary. We were stood up by public law 30 years ago this year.
Okay.
And in that, we became a defense-wide program, meaning that we own, like you just said in the onset, all of the funding for the department. So that funding is not seated with the services to develop and everything. We own the funding for all science and technology advanced development to deliver those capabilities. The services then are responsible for sustaining those per their requirements.
Excellent.
But anything you want me to follow up on that? DASD-ship is but it's a wonderful job because you get to work with the cream of crop and some of the most brilliant people.
Absolutely. And it was just, as you were mentioning, you used the word pivot before, and I was watching, and I recommend everyone listening and watching the show to take a look at this panel. It was you, Colonel Chris Grice, who we had on a few months ago, and then Darrell Colvin, Joint Program Executive Officer, and the title it was DITRA's Joint Science Technology Office Chem Bio panel session in 2022, and in the presentation, you mentioned, you talk about sort of as you were saying, the program goes back a bit. You were talking about the different pivots, how it's evolved over the years, and then there was a presentation or a report that comes out. This was entitled Approach for Research, Development, Acquisition, Medical Countermeasures, and Test Products. And I thought this was really interesting because in this document, you talk about the current pivot, which is all about I lay this out, and you can go into more details about it. Instead of in the future thinking about, again, Ebola or COVID or whatever the case may be, and looking at specific threats, biologic threats, you're going to think about more of the outcomes of those threats, because we might have a bunch of unknown stuff happening. And we know that these diseases and the countermeasures that we require may be for inflammation, they may be for coagulation, they may be for all sorts of other nasty things that these bugs create. Talk about this pivot a bit, because I think it's a very interesting concept, especially in the era we just came out of, where maybe we didn't care that much about the name of the thing, but hey, the cytokine release syndromes and all this other nasty stuff that was happening to us was really bad, and we need a lot of good drugs for that stuff in the future, probably.
Yeah. So no, appreciate it. It's a really important thing, but it's also a very difficult kind of pivot as we do. It's not one that's novel, meaning as we look at it, it's just about where you take risk and how you take risk. particularly for the warfighter. And it's not that folks, our partners in like BARDA and NIH and stuff, aren't doing very similar things. They're doing it for a different mission set, and we have different criteria, which means that risk we're taking has led us to the conclusion of how we're pivoting that medical countermeasure architecture. And so I think to say that, and let's go back to, you mentioned up front some of the early work on anthrax and stuff like that on the vaccine. Highly successful, and that's great, and it sits in our strategic national stockpile, and we have that for usage. But I mean, that research started in the 1940s, right?
Yeah.
The 1970s is when it was licensed. 1990s was the first time that troops started receiving it, and it wasn't until 2001 that the Lansing facility reached full operational capability for production of that. The whole point being is that medical countermeasures, as we know very much from COVID, from everything that preceded that, are extraordinarily expensive, in the order of billions of dollars, and take decades sometimes to get through licensure and stuff. Right. What we're recognizing, particularly as we and our responsibility to look at near peer competitors under the National Defense Strategy, is that the technology and the capabilities, as we talked about before, to manipulate, to bioengineer, to engineer life, to engineer science, makes it far more prevalent for adversaries to not only, and it doesn't take much, to perturb our overall identification or treatment and stuff on how we deal with pathogens that might be engineered. Set aside the fact that nature does that well on its own, and as we saw with the COVID outbreak anyway, and knowing an unknown in its overall ability to detect it and treat it and come up with countermeasures rapidly. We saw Operation Warp Speed do that with great success, but at the same time, we had corollaries to coronaviruses that predated that. So for the Department of Defense, we have to look at the way, because what I can't do, and it would be the same on the chemical side, you can look at things like pharmaceutical based agents and how they've been used by Russia, but as they weaponize, it's synthesis of chemical. That's what we see on the streets of America. We see fentanyls, we see opioids, we constantly see new analogs. It's easy to change, and so that meaning you're dealing with an unbound amount of synthesis within chemistry that creates a threat. Do I create 100 different auto injectors that the soldiers got strapped to him or in his kit for just 100 of those thousands or potentially unknown threats? No. And can I stop way out of that with one for every one? The same remains true on the biological side. And so when we've used the term one bug, one drug as a community in the past, we can't afford to actually develop one drug for the whole entire thing. And so as a result, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the technologies that give us access to and where we're going to take risk. And that means we have to focus more on broad spectrum related to repurposing of drugs, getting things in the pipeline, as we've seen with remdesivir and its use for Ebola over into COVID, right? As we use in silico and high performance computing and computational biology to look at not only novel antibodies, like look at how we're looking at repurposing drugs quickly, we're going to have to give soldiers broad spectrum capabilities. When we're presented then with an unknown pathogen or an unknown threat that we haven't seen and we have to characterize it rapidly, what we need to be able to do is that we need to have candidates on the shelf that are near to what we're doing. That means just like everybody else, we're going through and characterizing those viral families, 26 viral families, right? But we'll take pentavalent or trivalent related medical countermeasures, if it were a vaccine, for instance, and we'll take those through phase 1 clinical trials. And we'll even do manufacturing runs of 10,000 or 15,000 to show manufacturing, because oftentimes that's a difficulty. You may have a perfect candidate for an antibody, may not survive well on manufacturing platform, right? So manufacturer, put that on the shelf, but not go to full licensure. And that gives us the ability to start building a library out. Some of those will be candidates for going through if they're pentavalent, if they protect against two areas of different viral protections. But what we're hoping is that we can protect the warfighter early up front with broad spectrum, and also in some of those, and also as we look at it at their immunology. But when we come across a threat, how quickly can we pivot to a narrow spectrum and deliver it? That's going to be that's the thing. So how do we put candidates? How do we put backbones? How do we speed and optimize a system that can rapidly develop a narrow spectrum capability? And that's kind of what the pivot is. And it's not, like I said, it's not novel as much as we've talked about this for 2 decades. I think the technology and also the lessons learned out of COVID have made it far more of a reality. Not that there aren't huge challenges with doing that. For the DoD, the only other thing I would say is that brings additional problems into our mindset. If we think about near peer competition, and if you look into, our pacing threat challenge, not threat, within the national defense strategy is China. If you just look at Indo-PACOM, agnostic of China, if you were to come across a threat during a crisis or something like that by an adversary, how would you deliver it under contested logistics across the tyranny of distance within Indo-PACOM? So we have to look at the bookends, early characterization of unknown threats, how you actually determine if something's been engineered, or understanding the characteristics to activating an architecture that can rapidly start delivering and identifying how we protect our troops and stuff, and also for our population, because we work hand in hand with our public health and BARDA. And then 3, how do you deliver? So we have to look at things like expeditionary manufacturing or far forward if we're going to look at those things like biologics and small molecule being produced in theater, because they're not going to be readily available during a crisis or conflict and we're not going to be able to pre-position narrow spectrum because we don't know what the threat is. So those are some of the challenges that might have been a little lengthy, but I wanted to make sure it's a significant go through. That means we're taking a lot of risk in other areas and investing in technologies that meet the service requirements for speed, agility, and some of that broad protection abilities. And that's across the chemical and the biological space, because that threat really combines in certain areas.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate the topic of repurposing, which has again been so hot on many fronts lately, and the ability to explore, although it's not novel, the existing sort of pharmacotherapeutic space of stuff that we've had from the last 100 years, and what can be realigned and so forth. So no, I really appreciate that topic. Related to this, I mean, you're talking about some of the challenges. Was interesting. I had just yesterday, Dr. Shavonda Jacobs-Young on from USDA, and she was talking about the new National Bio and Agri-Defense Facility, and they put $1.25 billion into this, the first bio BSL-4 for their group. Just joking around that it's great that we have it, but these things, these things don't, they don't, you can't set them up in 2 days. Obviously, you're mentioning groups that you interface with, like BARDA, obviously DITRA. Talk a little bit about sort of how sort of the joint innovation works and some of the challenges, sort of the innovation front, because obviously now I know Fort Detrick is there, and that's BSL-4. Clearly, some of this is very complex R&D. We talked to the IARPA folks about, as you were just saying, about analyzing bugs and seeing what was engineered and what wasn't. Talk a little bit about sort of the joint sort of bio-innovation ecosystem here. I think it's important because you do have a lot of these great tools and centers of excellence available to you. Say a few words about that too, if you would.
And it's a great point, and that I'll focus a little bit on the last part of the last 2 sentences you have here. The U.S. government, we benefit from we're at no loss at this point in time for policy or strategy, right? And so with the restructuring of the National Biodefense Strategy, that's the intent, is bring the interagency into cohesion around how we actually defend against these threats, regardless of their purpose, whether that's population, our troop base, or our animal and our livestock or in crop related yields. But the point being is that in the past, it's been, I'll be frank, and I know some folks probably disagree with me, coordinating the interagency duplication, on making sure that we're augmenting one another and stuff is always, it's hard across any space, right? And stuff. And no matter what White House or administration is in place, that's always the endeavor underneath the executive orders and strategies to do so. And I think we do that. We have a very strong community that works very closely together, sometimes more so than maybe overt to the public. But I think to your last point, where we are today, that's a little bit different, that I have hope in, is that will strengthen. And let's talk about infrastructure and enablers a little bit. I think in the past, right now, the way we do those, the way we're working through those defenses, both on, doesn't matter if it's ag, public health, or defense and stuff, we're purchasing up mainframe computers, right? High performance computing capabilities. And so we're, like you said, we have certain labs, we can do certain in vivo and vitro related work at high containment laboratories. We're building AI algorithms separately, and some of those are black boxes. So the information that comes out on the one end, just like it was on any other AI, is sometimes hard to replicate. So if you're sharing between, how do you know that some groups, and particularly international partners, can use it for their regulatory purposes, right? So, but the whole point is, like I said earlier, we're all looking at all the viral backbones of the 26, the viral families and stuff. We're doing a lot of the same work, but the infrastructure we're putting in place is we're investing in now. And there's a lot of opportunity, because the outcomes, our mission sets don't, as opposed to in the past, don't constrain us as much, meaning we can do a lot of the same work in these high performance computing capabilities for different purposes, but we're all looking at it for our own reasons. And so I think the investments, and also some of the focus and decoupling on how we're truly trying to understand and I'll just keep it on the biological space, how are we actually prioritizing as an interagency? The other part I'd say is that it's a close community. So in and amongst those folks, we're talking about a cadre of scientists and really smart engineers and really smart people that have chosen not to go, that are choosing U.S. government to work in, and working in. And that's a special type of person. There's not much money to be made. And particularly with the revolution in biological sciences, there's a lot of onus for folks being able to depart. And we welcome that back out into industry and then coming back in. But the thing is also is that means a lot of our folks are transient. We have a lot of folks I worked with way back in DITRA, JSTO, doing medical countermeasures, who work for BARDA now. And I think the same is true. And so when you bring up across the ag space, the application and what we're trying to defend against, I think we're at a place that now provides an environment and an ecology for us to do more together and decouple than we ever have before. And to do so before we spend unnecessary infrastructure dollars for the U.S. government, because that's where some of our benefits really are, right? This is where the U.S. government can start to help industry, start to help academia, and some of these infrastructure and enablings across those things, like I said, computational biology and other things. So, meaning, I hope that kind of answers your question, Ira.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have great hope in it, but the community really is a pretty tight knit one, and we share in between. So you get a lot of expertise going in between, and that includes from the agricultural side of our biological defense side, and other words, right? We're all part of the BSAT related activities. We're all look at policies around high containment labs, how we actually protect against, on sequencing, on the double-stranded DNA synthesis guidelines, on gain of function. Though that's why we're commentative when we're thinking about those in those policies and what their implications are, both from empowering our bioeconomy, but also in protecting in making sure that there aren't accidents for the American people.
Yeah, no, that's spot on. And again, it's one of the reason I want to. When I interview cool thought leaders like yourself, and the fact that you do have these relationships with all of these other folks, and it is an ecosystem that's growing and learning from each other, I think it's an extremely important thing. So I appreciate you highlighting that as well. Let's move to December 2020 and have some fun here, because I've been having fun, but this one's going to be a lot. I
can't remember back that long, but yeah.
The White House National Strategy for Planetary Protection is released. Planetary protection. defined in this document as the policy and practice of protecting future scientific investigation by limiting biologic contamination of other planetary bodies through exploration activities, also called forward contamination, and protecting the Earth's biosphere by avoiding harmful biologic contamination by returning spacecraft, or also known as restricted return.
Yep.
I grew up in the the late 1960s, early 70s, as a huge fan of the Andromeda Strain, the movie and the book.
Who
Um,
isn't? Yeah.
and it's interesting because I don't even remember the main issue with that astro microbe, whatever you want to call it, was it caused rapid coagulation. So I think it probably fits in nicely with the new pivot. But talk a little bit, if you would, about planetary protection. A little bit. I mean, obviously, these are important things because we're sending more and more stuff up there, and whether it's an Andromeda Strain or whatever the thing may be, we got to think about this. And it's funny because I don't know if you watched our episode with Sarah Medad from New York Health and Hospitals, but she wrote this paper with Betsy Pugel from NASA and their sort of planetary protection focus, and more from a public health angle about, oh, if the Andromeda Strain dropped on Times Square, what you do about it. But take us through a little bit of planetary protection, and what you think about. When you
Well,
think
yeah, sure. It was super exciting. One, because this is another example where you're not looking for a mission and you're handed something that you had never thought of before. And they needed folks to work out of OSTP with the Space Council to work on this new strategy and update. Just so fortuitous that I got the opportunity to kind of lead through that program while I was there. But so, and first, I will make a full disclosure. There's planetary protection. There's also, I mean, there's also planetary. I mean, the planetary protection, which is actually which my kids thought I was working on, which is protecting the Earth from asteroids hitting it. Right,
yeah.
Two different complete programs. One has
Right.
Bill Nye visiting the vice president, and they work on those, and then planetary protection that, like you described it really well. So the interesting thing is that's just right with the Outer Space Treaty, but also with COSPAR and the United Nations, how you protect those celestial, because just like our conservation here on Earth, those are not owned by any one nation. And so it comes back to arms control, but it really comes back to negotiation of how you look at resources naturally occurring, not on Earth, to make sure they're preserved for particularly for scientific exploitation. And the dirtiest thing you can send is a human.
Yeah.
And stuff. The second a human touches base anywhere, you're going to contaminate. But what that means also is that traditionally, when we look at places to land on the moon, or even for all the mapping that NASA's done in Mars, we end up looking at landing in the least scientifically interesting places, and they have those zoned. The reason is because they're concerned about contamination. So the places on Mars that you may want to look for potential, some of the potential signs of life are the same places that they're reticent to send craft to, because we're worried about the contamination of that. And so it's a really interesting design to balance scientific preservation and the access to that. But really, I think you start thinking about things that I never thought about from a biodefense or biosecurity perspective that come directly into play, which why I enjoyed it so much. When you're thinking about those areas, the Viking spacecraft that were originally back in the 1980s, over 10% of its the entire budget and cost for that mission was on making sure that it was decontaminated to a level necessary to preclude contamination once it hit the surface, right? That we spend a lot of money, and it's not known, on making sure that what we're sending actually isn't delivering microbes, which can be very resilient, particularly in our bacterial area, into other surfaces. And then likewise, I think on the flip side, on return, when we have moon rocks coming back from early Apollo days, but even now, as you've seen Japanese and U.S. bringing back pieces of asteroid as we look to again embark on missions to other planetary and celestial bodies, how do you so working with CDC is a good example. How do we look at biocontainment? Because now, instead of, as you mentioned before, with the USDA and their new facility, we're used to protecting people from those, but we need to do dual containment. We need to we need to contain that sample from outside environment so it doesn't destroy the scientific relevance of that. So you could actually tell if life is present while protecting the communities and stuff outside of it. So how do you build a double containment biocontainment area and stuff? It's a really new proposition. You have both overpressure and under pressure through different seals. So it's an engineering feat. So I just say that because planetary protection brings in all of these, and I think we're going to see it, particularly with, we've seen all the launches to the moon by so many different countries, and even delivery of some foreign material on the surface by India accidentally. We need to be cognizant of that and stuff, and part of that is continuing to work with the international community to make sure that we're coordinating on where we land and recognize that those resources are for humanity, not for any one given country. So it was a fascinating time to work on planetary protection and stuff, and I learned tons. And just again, one of those topsy-turvy ways you end up where your career you never thought you'd be working. So
no, really,
but brilliant people working on it.
Yeah, no, it's and again, everyone listening and watching, check out the report. It's online, and again, it's interesting how you brought together, all these different agencies to think about this problem. So no, it's really cool. I noticed that in about 6 weeks, the 12th annual Joint Civil and DoD CBRN Symposium is going to be going on in DC. You're giving a keynote entitled "Leading DoD Efforts to Defend Against Current and Future Chemical and Biologic Threats," and it's interesting.
I never know anything until 2 weeks
I
out.
get ready for it. No, but it was interesting. I was looking at the agenda, and it was quite interesting to see, aside from all the thought leaders and the folks that you associate with the DoD that are going to be there, there's a bunch of other people there. There's FBI, there's a bunch of folks from municipal fire departments and police departments and so forth. A lot of people thinking about CBRN, thinking of WMD. Talk a little bit about the symposium, and just clearly the ecosystem is evolving beyond just the Defense Department in this context of thinking of these issues. Talk a little bit about and any other public-facing stuff that is going to be happening for you in the coming months that we should know about.
Well, yeah, and so I'm not sure if it's grown. I think we've actually been, defense is always, and not to be singular, we derived from what was an offensive capability back in the early 1970s into a completely defensive and protective program that was focused singularly on and is focused on making sure that not only our troops are protected, but we can fight and win in a contaminated environment, right? It is to make sure that we maintain lethality of our fighting force. But honestly, our state, local, and our federal folks that support those have been on the edge of when it comes to hazardous material remediation, mitigation, and also response activities for far long. And I'd say that the breadth of things they have to contend with, and the unknowns are different from ours, but not so much so, and just as complex. And so I think when we're looking at them, you see our communities, and you see FBI there from an attribution, from a law enforcement, if we see particularly things. So we have really what you're looking at is where authorities are overlaying, right? And there's a lot of opportunities and a lot of coordination that goes on between those, because a lot of those knowledge projects, like characterization of a new threat and making sure your state and local folks have access to that, so when they come across this situation, they know what it is they're coming in, how to treat it, how to identify it. Sharing those things from the Defense Department and also from Health and Human Services is really important. So I think, meaning the communities have been pretty robust, but the state and local folks is where it all kind of begins for the defense against not only just when we're talking about biological, but those chemical ticks, TIMs, other things. And I think that community has been very strong and always had been between our CBRN Corps and HHS and really FEMA and FBI. But they have their own authorities, right, and stuff. health response is the responsibility of ASPR, right? We're working with FEMA, as we saw with COVID. FBI has law enforcement authority and attribution capabilities and stuff like that. So how they come into these communities, it's really beneficial to make sure that when we have these conferences, they're worthwhile and they're really knitting together where those seams are that are beneficial to all, right? Because then we start seeing some of the benefit. So I've been really pleased in those communities, the thought perspectives that are brought to bear by those state and local, because they're critical. And for us, as we bring in not only our National Guard and our reserves responsible for the defense support to civil authorities during those situations, that the military side of the house and also those are in tight unison, as we had to see in COVID when we had to rely upon the department to help in some of the response activities on that. And so that's the first part of your question. Those forward leaning, though, I mean, I think real important things is, I mean, there's a lot we have to do in the chemical and biological defense program that are classified, right, and to protect that information against our adversaries as we develop them. But a lot of it's not, right, and as we talked about before. So the biodefense posture review, I think, is a really good signal out to the public and stuff is how the United States is organizing its roles and responsibilities to protect the nation against those type of threats. That was led by Ms. Rosenblum, my boss, actually, and our counterparts in policy. But it's equivalent to it's notable that that the Secretary of Defense called for that on par with the nuclear posture review and missile defense posture review, because it's of such importance to our leadership right now. And so I think that's a public facing document, and its implementation are important. And I know that our colleagues, such as in DHS, are looking to do their own posture review. I think that helps in that alignment. But other things is I think when we do our S&T conferences and stuff every 2 years and aligning our science objectives so that industry can forecast and credibly understand where our investments are. And then the multitude of industry and academic engagements and also programs that we have. So our outreach and the way we try to go out to the public, not just from an understanding of where their tax dollars are going and how we're defending the nation, but soliciting their help. Because honestly, we don't build anything inside. It is the reliance on these industry. And let's be clear, the stuff we do across protection, decontamination, across medical countermeasures, across all these novel spaces, not only are multi-material science, biological science, chemical, but they're high complexity, low density items. So we have to work in the interagency to make sure that there's benefit and profit for our industry partners, that there's adequate support across there, because they're not the F-35. We're not propping up a major industrial base by chemical or biological, or even on the other side of the house, unless you're a pharmaceutical company, you're not relying on the strategic national stockpile to keep your company afloat. That's not how this works in this space. And so it's really important that our forward leaning and talking with industry and doing that in combination with our interagency partners, so that we have purchasing power, so we actually have means by which to help our industry, is really important. Hopefully that kind of answers part of your question.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really fascinating where we are in 2024 with this, and of course, you taking us through the evolution of the program, and touching on everything from biodefense to the bioeconomy, all the innovation that needs to go in, including the acquisition, sustainment. No, it's and of course planetary protection, which is really awesome. Did I miss anything?
Yes.
Anything else in your portfolio that I missed that you might want to mention while we have you? I know we're getting close to the wrap up here, but in case there are any other topics within your group, please take the floor on our way out, or any final messages that you want to give to our audience.
No, I think the main thing is that being part of our program is one of the greatest jobs in the world. And so I would always solicit for workforce and people that are interested in the government. There's not much more of a difference you can make than coming in. We work on those high consequence, and the partners we get to work with are outstanding and stuff. And so we're constantly trying to solicit, and that's not just for us. I mean, I mentioned the community and the ecosystem that really depends upon those smart, and it's not just PhDs. It's across the board of individuals to come and work with the U.S. government and solve solutions that threaten our nation, but threaten our population and our health and and our agricultural folks. So I can't step away if I can't emphasize how important those jobs and how meaningful they really are to the lifeblood of all the departments, agencies, mission sets. I think the only other thing is hold us accountable, right? Those are having interviews with you, Ira, and also as we go out into conferences and do that public facing, understanding what we're delivering as far as the defense, not only of our warfighter but of the nation. Hold us accountable. Ask the questions. We need more of that engagement. We need more of it with our congressional and stuff, and we do have really good relations with it. But we're here to particularly, and we're making hard decisions. The medical countermeasure approach that we talked about earlier, it means taking risk. And if folks don't understand what those risks are for their dollars, and so meaning I think we've built out something really outstanding. I'm really proud on the direction that our particular program as part of the department's doing. I think we're going to be delivering better capability with more performance to actually protect in the future. And I like the position that our folks have put us in. But that means that we also need to be held accountable on hard questions about the direction we're going. So no, I won't. I just out to your viewership. Thanks for everyone that watches you and to the leaders and the different thought providers that come into it. And hopefully this was somewhat useful.
It definitely was. It was an awesome story. Wishing you and your team the best with all this as you continue to evolve the programs, make these pivots, and keep the country safe from these threats. Really great stuff. For everybody again that's going to be listening to this particular episode of our show across the various podcast networks or who'll be watching on our YouTube channel. Again, you've been spending time with Ian Watson, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Chemical and Biological Defense at the United States Department of Defense. Ian, again, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to talk to us for a little while today. Obviously, thank you for what you do and your long service to the United States. And as we like to say here on our show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow via the type of innovation you're championing. Really great story.
No, thank you so much, Ira, for having me.